Could you tell us a little bit about Ukraine, its history, even where it is on the map? Like suddenly all this attention is on this country, but there's so little
Right.
understanding of it.
Okay. It's a state of 44, roughly 44.5 million people. It became independent in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it had periods in its past where it had declared independence, particularly in the 20th century. Prior to that, you could say there were sort of signs of statehood in Ukraine. It had what was called a hetmanate in the 17th century. It had Cossack kingdoms. But for most of its history, Ukraine has been part of empires that were run by other states, mainly Russia, but also Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and also the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which ended in 1918. And after the revolution in St. Petersburg, Petrograd as it was then, in 1917, Ukraine declared independence the following January. But it was a time when the German army had entered Ukraine, and it only lasted a few weeks. And there was a period then, about 3 years, of constant civil wars, changes of government, until the Soviet Union, Soviet Russia as it was at that time, invaded and set up a communist government in the city of Kharkiv in the eastern part of Ukraine. And Soviet rule began, and Ukraine was accorded, of course, its own republic. It became the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and that was given a certain amount of autonomy, you could say, really, in the 1920s to develop its own national culture and language. But by the early 1930s, when Stalin was firmly in power, that completely changed, and the language was repressed. Your cultural life was also repressed. Many leaders were arrested and executed, and a famine took place in Ukraine in 1932, especially in 1933, which really devastated the rural regions. And following that, about 3.9 million people died in the famine, and it was followed in 1937 by the most serious purge that Stalin ever held, in which Ukraine suffered pretty badly. And not long after that, the Soviet Ukraine was expanded at the expense of Poland when the western part was incorporated by the Soviet Union, in tune with the German invasion of Western Poland. And World War II then followed with German occupation. There was some support for German occupation, particularly in the western part of Ukraine that had been under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But by and large, the German occupation was a pretty harsh affair, and something like 2.5 million Ukrainians served in the Red Army, played a pivotal role in the victory over Germany. But then the Soviet rule came back at the end of the war. For about 5 or 6 years, there was a guerrilla war in Western Ukraine against renewed Soviet rule. But eventually this was overcome really by superior forces. And many of these people died or were rounded up and arrested, many sent to Siberia and ended up in gulag camps. Subsequently, you could say Ukraine came fairly heavily under the sway of Moscow. There were periods when Ukrainians took part in the dissident movement in the 60s and 70s. But by the early 70s, Ukraine had a very strong communist ruler, Vladimir Strelbitsky, who remained in power until September 1989. So this was really into the Gorbachev period, before any kind of reform started to hit Ukraine, because it was kept very firmly within the Soviet alliance. Now, that's not to say that there was no support for Soviet rule in Ukraine, because Ukrainians played a role in that as well. In fact, many of the Soviet leaders derived from Ukraine. They were not Ukrainians, but they derived from Ukraine. Brezhnev was born in Ukraine, for example. Khrushchev was born in Russia, but he was raised in the Donbass region of Ukraine. And so there was a kind of tradition in Eastern Ukraine of being a communist heartland. But the period of independence came in 1991, and it was really gained through, I would say, popular movement called Rukh. There were several other movements at the same time, a Ukrainian Republican Party, a Green Party, and even, you could say, the branch of the Communist Party in the parliament also began to subscribe to nationalist ideas and eventually to independence. So the first president of Ukraine was a former ideological secretary of the Communist Party called Leonid Kravchuk. He became president in December 1991. He remained president until the summer of 1994, when he held an election and was narrowly defeated by Leonid Kuchma. These two names sound so similar, and that's a habit of Ukrainian history, to come up with people with almost the same names. And after Kuchma ruled for 2 terms. He came from the eastern part of Ukraine. He'd been manager of an arms factory fairly close to Russia. Ukraine kept fairly close to Russia while he was there. But in 2004 election, Viktor Yushchenko, who was head of a movement called Our Ukraine, contested the election with the sort of designated successor, Viktor Yanukovych, who was the candidate of Russia and had remained quite close to Russia. And in fact, Vladimir Putin carried out election sloganeering for Yanukovych in Moscow. And the result of that was a narrow win for Yanukovych as a result of votes coming in from the eastern part of Ukraine, from the Donbass. The news that this had happened brought masses of people out into the streets in Kiev. And it was noted that the number of votes coming in from the Donbass exceeded the number of electors in the Donbass. So not only were they all 100% in favor of Yanukovych, but they'd increased in numbers from the actual size of the electorate. So these protests went on for several days. Everybody in the protest was wearing orange. It was called the Orange Revolution. Yushchenko and Yulia Tymoshenko were two of the prominent people behind that. It was successful, and in the end, the second round of the election was rerun, and this time Yushchenko won the election. Yushchenko was, in my view, not a very strong president, and in fact, he spent a lot of his presidency outside Kiev, outside Ukraine, traveling around. He had several little pet projects. One was to make the famine in Ukraine, or Holodomor, to be declared an act of genocide. That was a big deal. He also made heroes of guerrilla leaders from the anti-Soviet forces in the Second World War, particularly Stepan Bandera, leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and Roman Shukevich, the leader of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. This incensed Russia, and I remember at the time in 2008, when he made Shukevich a national hero, the Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, who had just taken over as president, broke off relations with Yushchenko. In 2008 was also the year that NATO offered a membership action plan for Georgia and Ukraine. And both were interested. Georgia indicated it was going to accept. And as a result, 2 regions broke away from Georgia and the Russian army came in. And that was kind of the end of that. Ukraine was not invaded because it had never gone forward with this plan. But clearly, Russia was very concerned what would happen in 2010 in the next election. But it was won by Viktor Yanukovych, who, I mean, he hadn't fallen very far because even Yushchenko made him prime minister in his, I think when he fell out with Yulia Tymoshenko, which happened frequently, he made Yanukovych his prime minister. So Yanukovych remained prominent. He came back in 2010 former governor of Donetsk. He brought in all these Donetsk people who monopolized the cabinet. Prime Minister came from Donetsk, although he was an ethnic Russian. And so Ukraine became very much controlled by what you might call a Donetsk clan. It became extremely corrupt, and Yanukovych amassed a personal fortune. He also siphoned out a lot of state funds for his own uses. He lived in a huge palace outside Kiev. He had a zoo there. He lived like a prince. But in 2013, the European Union, which had been working with Ukraine from about 2008 in an Eastern Partnership project, invited Ukraine to be an associate member of the European Union. And Yanukovych indicated that he was interested. But just before the signing was due to take place in Vilnius in Lithuania, he changed his mind. He accepted instead a huge loan from Russia, from Vladimir Putin. I believe it was about $15 billion, and declared that he was no longer going to join the European Union as an associate member. This brought out a renewal of protests in the streets, which lasted about 4 months with interruptions, but about 4 months. It turned quite vicious towards the end. Many infiltrated these protests who were more extreme. They had weapons, and they took matters into their own hands. In February of 2014, snipers on the rooftops fired into the demonstrations, killed over about 100 people. And even to this day, no one's ever been brought to justice for those killings. Yanukovych fled from Kiev. He'd been very tentative about turning the troops on the demonstrators, and eventually decided to flee. And he went to Crimea, but eventually he ended up in Russia, where he is today. Putin at that time was at the Olympic Winter Games in Sochi. He left the games, went to the Duma, asked for special military powers, and then ordered the annexation of Crimea, which was not really resisted. The Russian Black Sea Fleet was already in the bays in Sevastopol, and it was in a completely controlling situation. And a referendum was held, but the referendum was never going to give it back to Ukraine. The two questions were, should Crimea be part of Russia, or should it go back to its 1992 constitution, which in fact gave it full autonomy from Ukraine? So there was no going back with that one. And of course, they agreed to join Russia. At the same time, in the spring of 2014, some of the troops, the so-called Little Green Men who had invaded Crimea, were sent to the Donbass and eastern Ukraine, and began to change governments in East Ukrainian cities, removing the ones who were pro-Europe, or let's say pro-democratic, and putting in pro-Russian governments. In most of eastern Ukraine, in places like Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, as it was then called, and several others, these governments were quickly removed by the progressive democratic forces. But in the Donbass region of Donetsk and Luhansk, it proved much more difficult to do that. And the leader of the separatist forces was a former intelligence agent from Moscow called Igor Girkin, who his official position was defense minister. And he carried out a very strict military regime in the areas where he was. And he set up a capital in Slavyansk, which is sort of in the central part of, or even western part of Donetsk region. And the Ukrainian acting president after Poroshenko left, a man called Alexander Turchinov, ordered what he called an anti-terrorist operation into the Donbass. And this made some progress. It was a bit of a ragtag army, but it made some progress. It was gradually pushing the separatist forces back. And at that point, Vladimir Putin abandoned Igor Girkin and his forces in Slavyansk, and clearly expected that they would be arrested or killed. But instead, Girkin took these forces and retreated to the city of Donetsk, living with the civilian part. But the Ukrainian army kept coming, and obviously was now firing on civilians because it was hitting the cities, and that particular city of Donetsk where the separatist forces had hidden out. At a certain point in this war, around August of 2014, just as it looked like the separatists might be defeated, the Russian army came over the border, surrounded Ukrainian forces in Ilovaisk, and simply massacred about 1,000 of them. And this brought the new president, Petro Poroshenko, into a situation where he felt there had to be a stoppage, and an armistice was signed, and an agreement was reached at Minsk, mediated by the great Democrat Alexander Lukashenko. And I won't dwell on this first Minsk Accord because war broke out again shortly afterwards and carried on until the spring of 2015, when once again the Russian army came in a big battle for the town of Debaltseve, which is halfway between Luhansk and Donetsk cities. It's a vital rail link. And the Russians came in to make sure the separatists won that one. And then we went back to Minsk. And the Minsk Accords were presided over by the foreign ministers of France and Germany, by the president of Ukraine, by the president of Russia, and they were also signed by the leaders of the two separatist republics, so-called Donetsk People's Republic, Luhansk People's Republic. So this accord said simply that the heavy weapons had to be removed, the opposing armed formations had to be moved away from the border. Ukraine agreed to give autonomy to these regions, and Ukraine would be allowed to regain control of its eastern borders. The heavy forces were pulled back. There was no more major clashes after that. But fighting continued, and Ukraine never had control over its own borders, nor did the Ukrainian parliament ever agree to give more autonomy to Donetsk and Luhansk regions, arguing that they didn't have control over these regions. They were under the control of separatist forces controlled by Russia. So this was not satisfactory to either side, and yet it continued for the next 8 years. But I think over these 8 years, the presidency of Poroshenko was hostile to Russia. It nationalized the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, for example. There was a clash in the Black Sea when Poroshenko declared martial law in late 2018. But in 2019, when there was an election, Poroshenko was defeated by Volodymyr Zelensky. And I felt at the time that this election was not about conflict with Russia. The election was about living standards, which had gone down quite dramatically in the period of Poroshenko's presidency. And as a result, Ukrainians elected a complete outsider, someone with no political experience, a Russian-speaking Jewish comedian, a television star, someone who was very as popular in Russia as he was in Ukraine, and a kind of political neophyte. And obviously, it seemed to me that Russia expected quite a lot from him, that this was someone they could work with. This was much more preferable to these nationalists, as they call them, neo-Nazis, who were running Kiev. But in fact, not a lot changed under Zelensky, and he followed the European direction that Poroshenko had set out. He also, more recently, into the third year of his presidency anyway, began to take steps to curb pro-Russian sentiments, pro-Russian media in Ukraine. He shut down several Russian language media. He also placed the leading pro-Russian oligarch, Viktor Medvedchuk, a member of parliament, under house arrest. And when that term expired, he renewed it. And these were not things that endeared him to Russia. So it seemed that Putin got more and more irate and at some point decided to take drastic steps. Having said that, I think that Putin has this kind of vision of Ukraine as part of the Russian past, part of the Russian world, by language, by culture, by religion. He's got a view of Ukraine that is really out of date, and his view of history is also very narrow. This is a sort of imperial view of the Russian past, where the Russian Empire is all powerful. Interestingly, I put a map up in a talk I gave here yesterday to show what the Russian Empire looked like in 1900. And this is where Putin is today. If you look at that empire, this is what he's thinking. These are the territories that he wants. And of course, it also includes the Baltic states and parts of Poland. It doesn't include the western part of Ukraine, Galicia, where the city of Lviv is. So I think that's where we are today. And if that describes Ukraine, it's economically, it's not a great power anymore. I mean, in the past, it was a great black earth agricultural region, also a very important industrial region in the east with coal and steel and chemicals. Today, it's more high tech, I think. It's much more oriented towards new industries. But it's a modern nation. And in spite of all the problems economically, and in spite of corruption, because Ukraine has suffered from that, it has remained democratic. Unlike Russia, unlike Belarus, Ukraine changes its president quite regularly, usually every 5 years, with one exception. And Russia has had, well, you could say 3 presidents, but really it's 2 presidents because Medvedev was just following Putin's orders. Belarus has had 1 president from 1994 onward. So that, I think, it's an indication that Ukraine is somewhat different from the other states. That's not to say it's not made some mistakes. I think the memory laws of 2015 were an error, in my opinion. The attempt to completely eradicate the communist period. Because harsh as it was, there were some elements of it that were not retrogressive, and there were also communists within Ukraine who worked for Ukraine's independence and Ukraine's future. So to some extent, I thought it was a mistake if you just replace the communists with some kind of national vision of the future, which Poroshenko tried to do. Having said that, no one deserves what's happening to Ukraine today. I mean, it's simply outrageous, and there's really nothing that can justify it.